When recent candid photographs of Pete Sampras surfaced online, a wave of genuine shock washed over the sports world. The man photographed walking through a California parking lot, carrying a simple shopping bag, looked nothing like the invincible athlete millions of tennis fans remember. His thick, dark hair has turned completely gray. The famously intense, upright posture has softened. At 54 years old, he looks like any other ordinary father running errands on a quiet weekday afternoon. For younger generations, the images might not register, but if you grew up watching tennis in the 1990s, seeing Pistol Pete aging so visibly feels like watching a piece of your own history quietly slipping away. During his prime, Sampras was not just a reliable champion, he was an athletic absolute. He spent 286 weeks holding the world #1 ranking and secured 14 Grand Slam singles titles. He essentially owned center court at Wimbledon. When he stepped up to the baseline, bounced the yellow ball with that heavy, hypnotic rhythm, and arched his back to deliver a first serve, the outcome often felt inevitable. Millions of households across the United States and the United Kingdom tuned in to CBS or the BBC just to watch him dismantle opponents. He did not seek the camera. He never screamed at umpires or smashed his rackets to entertain the restless crowd. His silence was his greatest weapon, a psychological wall that kept his rivals, and the public, at a firm, uncompromising distance. But what happens to a man whose entire identity was built on absolute control when the cheering finally stops? Most elite athletes struggle desperately with retirement. They cling to the spotlight, moving into broadcast booths, signing up for reality television, or staging endless exhibition tours just to feel the rush of the arena one last time. Sampras chose a completely different path. After hitting his final professional shot, he practically vanished from the public eye almost entirely. He did not chase lucrative television endorsements. He did not write a sensational tell-all autobiography to settle old scores with former rivals. He simply locked the heavy gates of his estate and retreated into a fiercely guarded private life. For nearly 2 decades, his disappearance remained a mystery to the sporting public, yet it was a deliberate, necessary sanctuary. He built a quiet world centered entirely around his wife, Bridget Wilson, and their 2 sons, Christian and Ryan. It was the peaceful, unobserved existence he had always craved while living out of hotel rooms and airport lounges for 15 years. However, that carefully constructed sanctuary has recently been shattered. The man who spent his youth dictating the pace of every match is now facing a devastating medical reality inside his own home, a situation where he dictates absolutely nothing. This video will answer the question that millions of longtime fans have been asking for years. What really happened to Pete Sampras after the stadium lights went dark? We will look beyond the pristine white shirts of Wimbledon and the classic Sunday afternoon rivalries to understand the human cost of his perfection. We will explore the hidden physical toll that forced him out of the game, the emotional burdens he concealed behind his famous poker face, and the heartbreaking family battle that recently forced him to break his long silence. The true story of Pete Sampras is not just about a tennis player who grew older. It is the story of a fiercely private man who conquered the world, walked away at the absolute peak of his power, and is now fighting a deeply personal war far away from the applause. To understand how Pete Sampras became the most dominant force in modern tennis, you have to picture a dimly lit basement in Maryland during the late 1970s. Long before the pristine grass of Wimbledon or the massive crowds of New York, there was just a quiet young boy, a wooden racket, and a blank concrete wall. While other children were outside playing loudly in the neighborhood, Pete would spend hours down there alone, hitting a yellow ball against the hard surface. Thud, thud, thud. He was fascinated by the simple, predictable physics of the game. If he swung the racket a certain way, the ball returned precisely where he expected. This basement routine offered him a sense of total control. When the Sampras family eventually relocated to the warmer climate of Palos Verdes, California, that solitary basement rhythm moved outdoors and onto the public hardcourts. In California, the local tennis community quickly noticed the boy with the frightening natural timing. He soon caught the attention of a local pediatrician and passionate tennis enthusiast named Peter Fischer. Fischer did not just see a talented teenager holding a racket. He saw a future Wimbledon champion. He began inviting Pete over to his house, setting up a clunky projector in the dining room. In the darkness, old 16mm films of Rod Laver and Ken Rosewall flickered across the wall. Fischer wanted Pete to study the classic, aggressive style of the older generation. However, to achieve that vision, Fisher demanded a brutal sacrifice. At 14, Pete possessed a highly effective two-handed backhand that was winning him local junior tournaments. Fisher told him to drop it and learn a one-handed backhand instead, believing it was the only way to eventually win on fast grass courts. For a young athlete desperate for immediate success, the change was an absolute. Pete's junior ranking plummeted. He started losing matches to kids he used to beat easily. He would walk off the local courts deeply frustrated, carrying the heavy weight of a stroke that felt entirely unnatural. Yet, this painful period revealed the true core of his personality. Most teenagers would have quit the experiment and returned to what felt safe. Pete stayed with it. He accepted the public humiliation of losing today for the distant promise of winning tomorrow. He quietly endured the mechanical repetition, refining his footwork and learning how to seamlessly move forward toward the net. He traded the comfort of baseline security for the dangerous thrill of the attack. That long, frustrating gamble finally paid off under the glaring lights of Flushing Meadows in the late summer of 1990. At just 19 years old, Pete arrived at the United States Open as a relatively unknown prospect. The tournament was packed with established, intimidating men. Yet, the quiet kid with the rebuilt backhand systematically dismantled them. In the quarterfinals, he ended Ivan Lendl's astonishing 8-year streak of reaching the final, relying on a barrage of heavy serves. He then dismissed John McEnroe in the semifinal. Waiting for him in the final was a young Andre Agassi. The visual contrast was jarring. Agassi stood on the baseline, wrapped in bright neon colors, soaking in the roar of the New York crowd. Pete stood quietly on the opposite side, looking almost anonymous in plain white clothing. But when the umpire called time, the anonymity vanished. Pete overwhelmed Agassi in straight sets, with a fearless display of power serving and precise volleys. At 19, Pete lifted the heavy silver trophy, becoming the youngest men's singles champion in the history of the tournament. The quiet boy from the Maryland basement had finally arrived, but the true emotional burden of his newly found greatness was only just beginning. Lifting that silver trophy in New York fundamentally changed Pete's life. Suddenly, he was no longer the hunter, he was the hunted. The sports media immediately placed a crushing weight of expectation on his 19-year-old shoulders. They expected him to dominate every single tournament he entered. For a brief period after that initial breakthrough, Pete struggled to carry the heavy crown. Critics whispered that his 1990 victory might have been a lucky 2-week run, but behind closed doors, away from the flashing cameras, he was quietly refining his game, preparing to take total ownership of the sport. The true measure of his greatness solidified in 1993, when he stepped onto the worn, slippery grass of Wimbledon. That historic surface rewarded exactly the kind of relentless, attacking tennis he had suffered to learn as a teenager. The crisp white uniforms, the strict traditions, and the hushed crowds perfectly matched his reserved personality. Opponents simply could not read his serve. He had a unique ability to disguise his toss, making it impossible to predict if the ball was going wide or straight into their body. Once the ball was in play, Pete would explode toward the net, finishing points in seconds. He won his first Wimbledon championship that year, defeating Jim Courier, and turned center court into his own private kingdom. He would go on to win 7 Wimbledon titles over 8 years, a suffocating level of dominance that left the rest of the men's locker room fighting for scraps. Yet, a great champion always needs a compelling rival. For Pete, that rival was Andre Agassi. They were the defining opposites of 1990s tennis. Agassi was an explosive baseline counterpuncher who treated the tennis court like a rock concert. He had the long hair, the denim shorts, the celebrity romances, and a magnetic personality that drew casual fans to the television. Pete was the absolute reverse. He wore traditional clothing, kept his head down, and rarely spoke to the press. Agassi invited people into his chaotic story. Sampras fiercely protected his. Fans were forced to choose sides. You either loved the rebellious energy of Andre, or you respected the cold, clinical execution of Pete. This contrast created a frustrating problem for Sampras. The media often labeled him as boring or robotic. Sports journalists complained that writing about Sampras was difficult because he refused to provide the drama that sold magazines. They wanted him to throw tantrum or smash his rackets. They mistook his extreme focus for a lack of personality. What the cameras completely failed to capture was the intense, boiling pressure he was holding inside. From 1993 through 1998, Pete finished 6 consecutive years, ranked as the #1 player in the world. Defending that position required a staggering level of physical and mental endurance. Every time he walked into a stadium, the guy across the net was playing the match of his life, desperate to slay the king. He absorbed that weekly assault in complete silence. He traveled from hotel to hotel, continent to continent, carrying the expectation of an entire sport on his shoulders without ever asking for sympathy. He made it look effortless on television, lifting trophy after trophy with a brief smile before packing his bags for the next city. But holding back that amount of stress for that long is a dangerous game. The human body is not built to sustain constant, unreleased tension. Eventually, the polished armor he wore so carefully in public was going to crack, and when it finally did, the entire world would witness it. The illusion that Pete Sampras was an unfeeling machine finally shattered under the stadium floodlights of Melbourne in early 1995. For years, his coach, Tim Gullickson, had been the stabilizing force behind the scenes. Tim was much more than a tactical advisor. He was a trusted friend who understood the heavy, isolating burden Pete carried. But during the Australian Open, Gullickson became seriously ill and was quickly flown home for medical tests. The diagnosis was devastating: brain cancer. Pete stepped onto the court to face Jim Courier in the quarterfinal, carrying that terrifying uncertainty. For 4 grueling sets, he tried to maintain his famous poker face. But early in the deciding 5th set, a single voice pierced the quiet stadium. A fan shouted from the stands, urging him to win it for his coach. Those words broke straight through the invisible wall Pete had spent his entire career building. Millions watching on television saw the seemingly unstoppable champion turn away, bury his face in a white towel, and begin to... His shoulders shook as he tried to regain his breath. When he stepped back up to the baseline, his eyes were visibly red. He was crying so hard he could barely see the ball, yet he somehow continued to fire massive, accurate serves. He won the match, but that night fundamentally changed how the public viewed him. He was not a cold competitor. He was a loyal man, terrified of losing someone he... Gullickson passed away the following year, leaving a permanent shadow over Pete's continued success. The emotional drain of losing his mentor was compounded by a hidden physical vulnerability. What the sports media rarely focused on was that Sampras lived with a genetic blood trait called thalassemia minor, a condition that can cause mild anemia and sudden, severe fatigue. Playing endless 5-set matches in the brutal summer heat was a constant physical tightrope. That hidden fragility was brutally exposed during the 1996 United States Open. In a grueling, late-night quarterfinal against Alex Corretja, the oppressive New York humidity drained every ounce of energy from Pete's body. Deep in the 5th set tiebreak, he stopped pacing. His face turned completely pale. Leaning heavily on his racket like a wooden crutch, right there behind the baseline in front of thousands of gasping spectators, he bent over and threw up onto the court. Almost any other player on the professional tour would have immediately retired from the match. He looked like he was going to collapse onto the cement. Instead, facing a match point just moments later, he wiped his mouth, tossed the yellow ball into the dark sky, and hit a wildly risky second serve ace. He miraculously survived the tiebreak, practically dragging his heavy legs across the finish line to secure the win. He went on to lift the US Open trophy again that year, but the television images told a different story. He was pushing his body and his mind far past their natural limits just to maintain his grip on the sport. The heavy serves still landed, but his physical recovery took much longer. A new generation of younger, faster players in the locker room could see the exhaustion setting in, and they were beginning to circle. By the summer of 2002, the sports media had practically written Pete's professional obituary. The man who once seemed completely untouchable was suddenly losing matches to players who would have barely won a set against him just a few years prior. He had gone more than 2 full years without winning a single tournament. The most glaring sign of his athletic mortality came at Wimbledon, the very grass courts he had ruled for a decade. He was placed on a small, unfamiliar outside court and defeated in the second round by George Bassel, a player ranked far outside the top 100. As Pete walked off that court, head bowed, carrying his heavy equipment bag, the television commentators openly wondered if they were witnessing an embarrassing end to a brilliant career. Journalists filled the morning papers with columns urging him to retire immediately, warning that he was slowly ruining his historical standing by stubbornly refusing to walk away. For a proud man who had built his entire adult identity around winning, those 2 years of losing were a quiet, isolating humiliation. His back ached constantly. His legs lacked their old explosive speed. The younger players in the locker room no longer feared him. But Pete refused to let newspaper columnists dictate the final sentence of his professional life. When he arrived in New York for the 2002 United States Open, he looked older and visibly tired. Given his low ranking and poor recent form, very few observers gave him a serious chance to survive the grueling 2-week tournament. Yet, match by match, the heavy, precise serve found its old rhythm. The stinging volleys returned. He fought his way through the draw, pulling the loud New York crowds firmly onto his side, until only one man stood between him and the championship. It was Andre Agassi. 12 years after they first met in a United States Open final as teenagers with everything to prove, they were standing across the net from one another as seasoned veterans. The scene felt perfectly complete. The loud, expressive counterpuncher against the quiet, traditional server. The match was a tense, heavy-hitting battle that tested both men physically. But late in the fourth set, Pete attacked the net one final time. Agassi's passing shot sailed long, landing just past the baseline. Pete threw both of his hands into the air, his face showing a rare mixture of absolute joy and complete, heavy exhaustion. He immediately climbed into the stands to tightly embrace his wife, Bridget, sealing his 14th Grand Slam title. Most athletes would have grabbed the microphone and announced their retirement right there while the crowd was still cheering. But Pete was never a man for theatrical public statements. He simply took his silver trophy, packed his bags, and went home to California. He did not play another professional tennis match. What happened next deeply confused the sports entertainment industry. Unlike other famous athletes who transition straight into the broadcasting booth to remain on television, or who desperately seek out exhibition tours just to stay relevant, Pete walked away completely. He did not need the applause anymore. He had given his youth and his nervous system to the extreme demands of the tour. He traded the roar of the stadium for the quiet, predictable routine of a private family life. Successfully pulling off the hardest trick in professional sports, he left exactly when he wanted to, leaving the world wanting more. For a man who spent his entire youth operating under the blinding glare of stadium lights, the heavy gates of his California estate offered exactly what he had always wanted: absolute privacy. While his old rivals were busy building personal brands and sitting in crowded broadcast booths, Pete was perfectly content, driving his 2 sons, Christian and Ryan, to school. He and Bridget built a quiet, steady life, far removed from the circus of professional sports. For 20 years, he was simply a husband and a father who happened to have a collection of silver trophies sitting quietly in a back room. But life has a way of finding you, even behind locked gates. The gray hair and the aged, exhausted appearance that recently shocked fans in those candid parking lot photographs are not simply the result of natural aging. They are the visible physical markers of a man carrying a tremendous personal weight. In October 2023, Pete did something he had carefully avoided for his entire adult life. He reached out to the public for emotional support. Through a brief, deeply personal statement, he revealed that Bridget had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer in December of 2022. He explained that his wife had already endured major surgery, pushed through difficult rounds of chemotherapy, and was continuing with targeted maintenance therapy. He asked the public for their prayers, praising the incredible resilience of his sons and the immense courage of his wife. It is difficult to overstate how profound this shift is. Pete Sampras built his entire legacy on the concept of absolute, uncompromising control. If a match was slipping away, he could simply toss a ball into the air and hit an unreturnable serve to fix the problem. He was the master of his environment. Now, he finds himself sitting in quiet medical waiting room, holding his wife's hand, facing an aggressive disease where his discipline, his wealth, and his 14 Grand Slam titles offer absolutely no control over the outcome. There is no scoreboard to watch and no guaranteed timeline for a victory. This is the true reason the great champion disappeared from the public eye, and it completely changes how we should view him. He is not a broken athlete hiding from the world because he lost his former glory. He is a fiercely loyal husband standing exactly where he needs to be, protecting his family during the most frightening chapter of their lives. The quiet determination that once allowed him to push through physical collapse on the tennis court is now being used for something far more important than a game. Which Pete Sampras match do you remember most clearly, and where were you watching it? Share your memories down in the comments below. And if you enjoy revisiting the lives of the athletes who defined an era, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.